It all started with a nagging suspicion. You know, that gnawing feeling in the pit of your stomach that tells you something is terribly wrong, even though you can't quite put your finger on it. That's what I felt every time I looked at Claire. The woman I had married, the love of my life, seemed distant, detached. At first, I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just stress from work. But then the late-night phone calls began. The whispered conversations behind closed doors. And worst of all, the lingering scent of a man's cologne on her clothes, one that wasn't mine that I decided to follow her one evening. I told her I'd be late at work, but instead, I parked a block away from our house and watched. My heart pounded as I saw her leave, dressed to the nines, a look of excitement on her face that I hadn't seen in months. I trailed her to a small, out-of-the-way motel. The kind of place where secrets go to die. It began as a faint, unsettling feeling, like a shadow lingering just out of sight. Claire had been acting differently, colder, more distant. I tried to brush it off as work stress or something harmless, but the signs were too obvious to ignore. The late-night texts she quickly hid from view, the hushed phone calls she took in the bathroom, and the subtle change in her scent, a fragrance that wasn't mine, but someone else's that I couldn't shake the growing suspicion that something was wrong. So, one evening, I told Claire I'd be working late, but instead, I parked down the street and watched our front door. My heart raced as I saw her emerge, dressed more carefully than usual, her eyes alight with an excitement that had nothing to do with me. I followed her, my mind spiraling into dark places, until she stopped at a rundown motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where secrets are kept hidden. That I sat in the car, watching Claire disappear into the motel, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My thoughts raced, bouncing between denial and fury, disbelief and devastation. It was true. All of it. She was cheating on me. The woman I had loved, trusted with every fiber of my being, was in there with someone else, but instead of confronting her then and there, I felt a cold, calculating calm settle over me. My mind began to work, piecing together a plan. Confrontation would do no good, it would only lead to lies, denials, and crocodile tears. No, I needed something undeniable, something that would expose her for what she truly was. That night, after Claire returned home with her well-practiced smile, I acted as if nothing had changed. I pretended to believe her stories about spending time with friends, her late-night work meetings. But as soon as she fell asleep, I quietly got out of bed and set my plan into motion. That I installed a discreet recording app on her phone, something that would capture everything: calls, texts, even the sounds in the room. Every conversation, every deceitful whisper would be saved, unchangeable, unerasable. I felt a chill run down my spine as I tested the app, hearing my own voice echo back to me through the speakers. There was no turning back now. Over the next few weeks, I collected everything: late-night phone calls filled with giggles and sultry tones, texts dripping with passion, and worse, recordings of their encounters. Each time I listened, the anger and betrayal grew, but I stayed quiet, calm, methodical. The recordings weren't just for me, they were for everyone she had fooled. Her friends, her family, her colleagues, everyone who thought Claire was a sweet, loyal wife. They would all hear the truth. With each recording, I carefully organized and labeled the files, preparing for the moment when I would send them out. It wasn't enough to catch her, I wanted to destroy her, the way she had destroyed me. The day had finally arrived. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a signal that the final piece of evidence had been captured. It was a text message, short and simple: "Meet me tonight." Usual place. It was all I needed, the last nail in the coffin. That I had spent weeks perfecting my plan, meticulously organizing every recording, every incriminating detail. The files were now arranged in folders, labeled with dates and times, ready to be sent out. I sat in our living room, my heart beating steadily as I finalized the email drafts, one for her parents, another for her best friend, and the most damning one, addressed to her boss and colleagues. Each email contained a carefully worded note, expressing my shock and pain, along with links to the recordings. It was all there, everything they needed to see her for what she really was. That I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction as I typed out the subject lines, "The truth about Claire, what you need to know, listen carefully." I hovered over the send button, taking one last deep breath before pressing it. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. In an instant, the emails were sent, the truth unleashed like a storm that would soon engulf Claire's world. That I sat back, watching the status bar confirm the deliveries. There was no turning back now. My phone began to buzz almost immediately, first, a frantic call from her mother, then a barrage of texts from her friends. I could only imagine the chaos erupting in those conversations. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more step. That I sent a final message to Claire, simple and direct, "I know everything." I didn't have to wait long for her response. Within minutes, she called, her voice shaking with panic. "What do you mean?" she stammered, but I could hear the fear, the realization that her web of lies was unraveling. "I've sent them everything, Claire. The recordings, the texts, all of it. Your parents, your friends, your boss, they all know now." Her gasp on the other end of the line was like a dagger to the heart. She began to cry, begging, pleading for me to reconsider, to somehow undo the damage. But there was no undoing this. Her world was about to crumble, and I was going to watch every second of it. As I ended the call, I could hear her sobbing, the sound of her desperation filling the silence of our once happy home. It was only the beginning. The real terror was yet to come. The aftermath was even more devastating than I had imagined. The day after I sent those recordings, Claire's world shattered completely. I watched it all unfold from the safety of my office, the digital storm I had unleashed consuming her life. The first call came from her mother. I heard it through the app on Claire's phone. Her voice was thick with disbelief and disgust. "How could you do this, Claire? What the hell were you thinking?" Claire's pleas were barely coherent, her words choked with sobs, but there was no sympathy on the other end. The call ended with a deafening silence that spoke volumes. Then came the call from her boss. It was cold, professional, and final. "We've received some very disturbing information, Claire. I'm afraid we can't allow this sort of behavior to reflect on the company. You'll need to come in and collect your things." The line went dead before she could respond, leaving her in stunned silence. That I watched the messages roll in from her friends, some expressing shock, others anger, and a few cutting ties immediately. It was like watching a house of cards collapse, each piece of her life falling apart with ruthless efficiency. Claire was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. When she finally came home that evening, she was a shell of the woman who had walked out that morning. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale and hollow. She barely acknowledged me as she stumbled through the door, dropping her bag on the floor and collapsing onto the couch. The weight of what she had lost was crushing her, and I could see it in every trembling breath she took. But there was something else in the air, something dark and oppressive that seemed to seep into the very walls of our home. The silence between us was thick with unspoken words, the tension palpable. I could feel her fear, her desperation, and it only fed the cold satisfaction that had been building inside me. That I didn't say a word to her that night. I just sat in the armchair across from her, watching as she stared blankly at the floor, the realization of what she had done sinking deeper with each passing second. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, darker, as if they were closing in on her, suffocating her under the weight of her own guilt. That it was only then that I noticed something strange, whispers, faint and almost imperceptible, just at the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the mind after everything that had happened. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the corners of the room, from the very shadows themselves. Claire must have heard them too. I saw her flinch, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for the source of the sound. She looked at me, her face twisted in fear and confusion, but I said nothing. I just stared back, the cold detachment in my eyes reflecting the growing terror in hers. The house had turned against her. The whispers, the shadows, they were closing in, feeding off her guilt, her shame. And as I watched her break down, I realized that the recordings were just the beginning. The real horror was what came after, the unseen force that had taken hold of our home, turning it into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The days that followed were a descent into madness. Claire had stopped going to work, not that she had a job to return to. Her friends, those who hadn't cut her off, left her messages of pity, thinly veiled with disdain. Her parents had gone silent, their disappointment a void that consumed her. She was completely alone, trapped in a house that no longer felt like a home, and those whispers, they didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, creeping into every corner of our lives. At first, I could barely make out the words, but now they were clear, hissing accusations, reminders of her betrayal. They called her a liar, a cheater, a fraud. Sometimes they would laugh, a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. I wondered if I was imagining them, but the look in Claire's eyes told me she heard them too. She tried to drown them out, turning up the TV, blasting music through her headphones, but it was no use. The whispers were inside her head now, eating away at her sanity. I could see it in the way she flinched at every shadow, the way she started talking to herself, mumbling apologies to no one in particular. The once confident, vibrant woman I married was disintegrating before my eyes. One night, I found her sitting in the dark, her back pressed against the wall, knees drawn up to her chest. She was staring into nothing, her eyes wide and unblinking, her lips moving in a silent conversation with the voices only she could hear. "Claire," I called out softly, but she didn't respond. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. Her hands were trembling violently, and in her lap was the phone. My phone. The one I had used to record everything that I reached for it, but she yanked it away, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition, a plea for help. But then something changed. Her expression twisted into one of pure, unbridled terror. "They won't stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They keep telling me, all the things I've done. All the ways I've hurt you. I can't take it anymore." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was no longer just guilt. It was something else, something darker, feeding on her despair. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, as if alive, as if they were drawing closer. "Claire, you need to put the phone down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can fix this. We can," but before I could finish, she let out a blood-curdling scream. It was a sound that I will never forget, a sound that tore through the air like a jagged knife. She threw the phone across the room, and it shattered against the wall. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a cacophony of voices all shouting at once, drowning out her cries. Claire bolted from the room, running blindly through the house. I chased after her, my heart pounding in my chest. She reached the stairs, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a terror so profound it left me frozen in place. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry," and then she stepped backward, her foot slipping off the edge of the top stair. The world snapped back into focus as I lunged forward, but I was too late. Claire tumbled down the stairs, her body twisting in ways it shouldn't, until she hit the bottom with a sickening thud that I raced down to her, my breath catching in my throat. Her body lay crumpled at the base of the stairs, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, unmoving. The house fell silent, the whispers finally, mercifully, stopping. That I knelt beside her, reaching out with trembling hands to close her lifeless eyes. The woman I had loved, the woman I had destroyed, was gone. But as I sat there, alone in the dark, I realized the horror wasn't over. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, shifting closer, as if watching, waiting, and then, just as I began to stand, I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the darkness around me. "Your turn."